She was the quiet light of a noisy decade, the softest presence in a world that couldn't stop watching. For years, fans wondered what really happened between Susan Dey and David Cassidy. Were they the golden pair television promised, or two young souls caught in the machinery of fame? Now, at 72, Susan Dey has finally spoken, not with gossip or bitterness, but with the calm honesty of someone who has lived long enough to understand what love, youth, and regret truly mean. Her confession isn't about scandal. It's about growing up under lights that never turned off, and learning to forgive someone she once quietly adored. Before that truth could be told, though, we need to step back to where everything began, to the small-town girl who learned resilience long before she learned fame. Susan Halleck Dey entered the world on December 10, 1952, in Pekin, Illinois, a place where winters were long, families close-knit, and dreams modest. Her childhood was defined by contradiction, comfort and fragility, laughter and grief. When Susan was still a child, her mother passed away, an absence that settled like a shadow over the rest of her youth. Her father, Robert Dey, a newspaper editor, packed up what was left of the family and moved to New York. He poured himself into work. She learned to live inside quiet spaces. He taught her that words have power, that a sentence carefully built can expose truth or heal pain. From him, she inherited both intellect and empathy. At school, she was bright but reserved, the kind of girl teachers remembered for thoughtfulness rather than noise. Friends later said she seemed older than her age, as if she'd already seen something she couldn't quite explain. By 16, she was modeling part-time, more to help the household than to chase glamour. Her pictures appeared in teen magazines, fresh-faced, unguarded, luminous. Photographers noticed the stillness in her eyes. Casting agents soon would too. She didn't yet know it, but the camera had found its muse. One photo, one phone call, one audition, and the trajectory of her life would pivot from anonymity to immortality. In 1970, television needed innocence. The world was weary from war, politics, protest. Audiences wanted melody, color, and family again. So when the Partridge family began casting, producers looked for faces that felt safe, people the public could love instantly. Susan was 17, inexperienced and untrained. Yet when she walked into that audition, the room fell silent. Her presence wasn't loud, it was sincere. She radiated something that couldn't be faked, grace. She was hired almost immediately to play Laurie Partridge, the quick-witted daughter with a guitar and a conscience. Beside her was David Cassidy, the effortlessly magnetic lead, already carrying the legacy of his famous father, Jack Cassidy, and his stepmother, Shirley Jones. From the first day on set, their chemistry was undeniable. He was the comet, she was the calm orbit around him. Audiences didn't just watch their scenes, they believed them. Within months, the Partridge family became a phenomenon. Posters filled teenage bedrooms, lunchboxes, records, tour specials, their faces were everywhere. And for Susan, the transformation was dizzying. One year she was a high school student with a part-time modeling job. The next she was recognized in every airport, every shopping mall. But fame at 17 is a fragile gift. The adoration that lifts you up can also trap you in amber. For Susan Dey, the price of that overnight success was innocence, and it would take decades to reclaim it. Behind the scripted laughter, she was still learning who she was. And standing beside her every day was David Cassidy, the boy every girl wanted, the man she would come to love in silence. Off camera, the gentle rhythm between Susan Dey and David Cassidy began to shift. Hours of filming, rehearsals, and publicity tours blurred into a single long day that never seemed to end. Somewhere in that constant glow, affection quietly turned into something deeper. He was funny, magnetic, and kind, Susan would later recall. I was 17 and still figuring out life. Of course I had a crush on him. Every small kindness, a smile during a long take, a word of reassurance before an interview fed the feeling. But David lived inside a storm. He was mobbed at airports, followed by screaming fans, chased by cameras even at night. He was barely 20, carrying the weight of global idolatry. To survive, he built armor out of charm. Susan admired him from a distance, too respectful to intrude, too young to understand how fame distorts intimacy. When reporters asked about romance, she deflected with practiced grace. She would rather guard the truth than cheapen it. Then came the magazine article, the one that would cut deeper than anyone expected. David, half joking in an interview, mentioned her crush as if it were harmless trivia. For him it was filler between questions. For her it was a betrayal. "I felt exposed," she said years later. "Something personal became public, and once that happens, you can't take it back." From that day, a veil dropped between them. They were still kind, still professional, but the warmth had cooled. Fans never noticed. The cameras hid the ache. Yet every smile she gave on set carried a hint of restraint, a quiet reminder that sometimes heartbreak doesn't shout, it simply withdraws. Still, she never spoke against him. She let time move forward, holding on to dignity as the only thing the tabloids couldn't touch. Fame in the 1970s was different, raw, relentless, without filters or rest. There was no social media to correct rumors, no privacy once the world decided it owned you. For a teenager like Susan, the glare was blinding. Producers demanded constant perfection, hair always brushed, voice always soft, smile never fading. When exhaustion crept in, she hid it behind professionalism. When loneliness surfaced, she turned it into quiet discipline. David coped with fame by running toward it. Concerts, photo shoots, interviews. Susan survived by retreating from it. Journaling, reading, writing letters she never sent. Two different methods of handling the same burning spotlight. Years later, she would admit that fame stole normal milestones from her. No prom, no carefree college days, no slow discovery of adulthood. Everything happened under scrutiny, with millions judging every outfit and every glance toward her co-star. By 22, she was tired of being Laurie Partridge. The role that had made her famous now threatened to define her forever, and so began her quiet rebellion, the decision to step into darkness and show the world what she could really do. In 1977, the industry finally saw what Susan had kept hidden: depth. In the television movie Mary Jane Harper Cried Last Night, she portrayed a mother spiraling into mental illness. It was harrowing, unglamorous, and shockingly raw. Critics were stunned. Gone was the sweet teenager with a guitar. In her place stood a woman capable of breaking hearts with a single tremor in her voice. She had shed her innocence on screen and replaced it with truth. The performance opened doors to roles that demanded courage instead of perfection. Throughout the late 70s and early 80s, she gravitated toward stories about survival and self-worth, quietly proving that authenticity could be more powerful than celebrity. Then, in 1986, came L.A. Law. The role of Grace Van Owen transformed her career and television itself. Grace was intelligent, composed, and uncompromising, a woman who carried authority without losing compassion. Viewers saw themselves in her strength. Young actresses began to cite Susan Dey as proof that femininity and power could coexist. Awards followed: one Golden Globe, several Emmy nominations, but more important was the respect. On set, she led by calm example. She arrived early, knew every line, treated every crew member with courtesy. People called her the quiet storm, never loud yet impossible to ignore. By the early 90s, she had conquered what few child stars ever could: the transformation from curiosity to credibility. And yet, even as success surrounded her, a piece of her heart remained tethered to that earlier chapter, the one filled with music, laughter, and a boy named David Cassidy. When the lights of L.A. Law dimmed each night, Susan went home not to parties or red carpets but to silence. She had learned that peace was a luxury more precious than applause. In 1976, she had married Lenny Hershon, a Hollywood agent whose calm steadiness seemed to balance her introspective nature. He was decades older, worldly, protective. For a while, that stability felt like safety. They welcomed a daughter, Sarah, in 1978, the first person to ever see Susan without the mask of performance. Motherhood changed everything. Between call sheets and bedtime stories, she began to measure success differently, not by ratings or awards, but by the small miracle of an ordinary day. Yet the same career that had united them slowly began to divide them. Hershon's world revolved around clients, deals, and phone calls that never stopped. Hers revolved around creating truth inside imaginary lives. By 1981, the marriage ended quietly. No scandal, no bitterness, just two people acknowledging the distance that ambition had carved between them. They stayed kind. They co-parented, and Susan built her next chapter around her daughter's laughter. Nearly a decade later, love returned. Not dramatic, not headline-worthy, but real. In 1988, she married Bernard Safransky, a respected television producer whose temperament mirrored her own. He understood the strange rhythm of show business, yet craved privacy as much as she did. Together, they built a life far from the tabloids, a home filled with conversation instead of cameras, with friends who valued silence as much as success. When reporters came calling, she simply declined. When awards shows asked her to present, she politely said no. Her world grew smaller, but richer. By the early 2000s, she had quietly stepped away from acting. She attended reunions, sent notes to old colleagues, occasionally lent her voice to charity causes, and then disappeared again into the ordinary bliss of anonymity. For someone who had once lived inside the constant hum of public attention, the sound of quiet was not loneliness, it was freedom. For decades, she avoided interviews about the Partridge family. Every mention of it seemed to reopen a door she had long since closed. But time softens the sharpest edges, and when she finally chose to speak, her voice carried both nostalgia and forgiveness. "We were just kids," she said gently. Everything was new, the fame, the attention, the music. It was thrilling and terrifying all at once. She remembered David with warmth rather than resentment. He had that spark. When he walked into a room, the energy changed. I think we were all orbiting around his light. Her crush, once so secret, now felt like a fond relic of youth. "I don't regret it," she admitted. "I only regret that we didn't talk again before he was gone." When news broke of David Cassidy's passing in 2017, Susan retreated into silence once more. Friends said she watched the tributes privately, eyes wet but calm. Later, when she finally spoke about him, her words were neither sorrowful nor self-pitying, just honest. Looking back, I realize how young we were, how impossible it was to understand what fame does to people. He carried the burden of being adored by millions. I carried the burden of being known because of him. We were trying to survive something beautiful and dangerous at the same time. She paused, then added softly, "I wish him peace." That single sentence said everything. No resentment, no need for closure, just gratitude. Because the story of Susan D. and David Cassidy was never a scandal to be solved. It was the story of two young hearts learning how easily affection can be lost inside the machinery of stardom. Today, Susan lives quietly, surrounded by the simple things that fame can't buy. Morning walks, family dinners, the laughter of grandchildren. She rarely grants interviews, yet her legacy endures in reruns, in the calm strength of Grace Van Owen, in the memory of that shy teenager with the guitar. Her truth about David Cassidy is, in the end, the truth about life itself, that love doesn't always arrive in the form we expect, that forgiveness can heal what apology never reached, and that time, if we let it, turns pain into perspective. So when people ask what happened between them, her answer is gentle. We were young, we made mistakes, but we also made something that made people happy, and that's enough. Half a century after the Partridge Family first aired, millions still hum those songs without realizing what they meant to the people who sang them. Behind every smiling poster was a human being, fragile, uncertain, yet determined to keep shining. Susan Dye's story reminds us that growing up under fame's spotlight can take pieces of your soul, but it can also reveal your strength. She turned pain into privacy, heartbreak into humility, and regret into peace. And perhaps that is the quietest kind of triumph. If you remember the laughter, the music, or the comfort that the Partridge family brought into living rooms across America, press like as a small tribute to the young stars who gave up their innocence so that the rest of us could smile. Leave a comment sharing your memories, because sometimes nostalgia is not sadness, it's gratitude dressed in song. Susan Day no longer chases applause, But her story still sings, softly, truthfully, and forever.